Hello world, you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In today's episode, we'll be doing something a little different. We'll be interviewing David Khandan, Executive Director of an Australian security company that operates in the Arabian Gulf and Horn of Africa regions. The company's name, Austability. David is Austability's Executive Director for Strategy and Relationships. As an aside, I should also disclose to our listeners that Sage International Australia recently signed an MOU with Austability, since we are both interested in maintaining stable and just security domains in both of these critical regions, and our two organizations are well aligned organizationally and philosophically. For those of you who would like to know more about Austability after listening to this podcast, I encourage you to look them up on their website www.austability.com. Also joining us today is SIA's Associate and Resident Existentialist Philosopher, David Olney. And a warning. Unfortunately, the risk of running a podcast such as STRATEGIKON is that sometimes the technology doesn't deliver the best quality sound. Bandwidth can be a problem when either our preferred communications platform Skype is being pushed to its limits, or in this case, when communicating with a country that actively makes voice over Internet Protocol or VoIP signals difficult. Therefore, you may find a dip in sound volume when David and I were interviewing David Khandan. There was no fix for this issue, but we believe that if you stick with this episode, you may still find it interesting nonetheless. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that STRATEGIKON can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. So David, as an introduction to our audience, can you please introduce yourself and tell us how you came to develop Austability?
Well, my name is David Khandan and I'm the Executive Director of Strategy and Relationships for Austability Pty Ltd. Now, Austability is a small, medium-sized organisation, an Australian organisation, with its focus being development of new capabilities or enhancing of current capacity of national security and defence agencies in the fight against terrorism, transnational and serious organised crime. So we basically look at what it can be done to develop new strategies that will keep communities safe, not only in Australia, but mostly throughout Middle East and Africa as well.
David, what got you interested in this area and made you sort of take the leap into being part of a new company in such a difficult region to work?
Look, basically what interested me was that looking at the environment, particularly over the last decade or so, what I found or what we found was that the national security agencies or defence agencies were continuously trying to apply old solutions to the new problems. Now, particularly if you look at the landscape or the operating environments of terrorism, transnational and serious organised crime, they are rapidly changing and they always change. And at times they remain more agile. We felt that the operating environment of the national security agencies required a new approach. And that new approach was to be more involved in community engagement strategies and basically understand the nature and the source of the threats we're facing, not only now, but in the near future, that will be emerging. The whole concept was very interesting for us, yet easy to address as long as we are able to educate the industry as such that basically old solutions to new problems will not work. And that is what we find quite rewarding, to try and develop new strategies.
So very much start small enough to be able to stay mobile and adaptable, because everyone's got to accept new ideas or bring new people on with new ideas, rather than get into that sort of stymied hierarchical culture of so many big national security organisations.
That is the key, David. And what we find as well is that mainly our national security agencies or governments, they're not so accepting of change. They're not so accepting of new strategies or innovative methods in which we must counter these threats. So whilst they're not very accepting of innovative manners, even though there is good talk about it, but in action, they're not very welcoming of those innovative measures. We find that the adversaries of peace, or organizations that are challenging our way of life, or the way of life of every human being, are quite accepting of innovative and new measures to create new security threats. So whilst they remain agile and innovative, we seem to stay still and think that what we did even last year or 6 months ago could address what's coming at us 6 months from now. So you're absolutely spot on that staying agile, accepting of new measures and developing new strategies would be the key, in our opinion, to challenging the emerging threats.
So, David, what do you think are the strengths of your organisation, especially against other companies that operate within the same space?
The strength, and we found what's actually been capable, that has actually worked really in our favour, is we will not take on a project or anything that we're invited to look at unless we feel that we have the ability to fully understand the drivers and the operating environment of the threat we're trying to develop countermeasures for. So in another sense, what we do not do is simply take on a project because it has a fee attached to it. We take on a project because we feel we can actually make a difference. So two things really matter to us. One, to ensure that we have the ability. When I say the ability, I'm not referring to our in-house subject matter expertise. I refer to ability by being able to get across or past the red tapes that exist in order to truly understand the drivers of terrorism in a particular geographical area, for example. Because only then you can sit down and develop strategies and capability and be able to build a consensus as to what success looks like. So the short answer to your question, John, I feel that our main differentiator is that we actually do this because we do want to make a difference and actually make the world a little bit safer than when we found it, rather than being an organisation that is driven by the bottom dollar or the high revenue turnover, etc. That's what I feel it is.
You made mention earlier, David, that terrorism and transnational crime are fluid concepts, and indeed they are. So what is unique about Austability's skill sets and methodology to act as viable counters?
So one of those things is that we really try and push differently, is that if you look at the triangle, if we can say, if you look at the triangle of transnational and serious organised crime, there is an element to it where you have the national security agencies that directly bring the fight to the adversaries or the offenders. Then you have an element that reduces the opportunity of these things taking place, and then there is an element which are the victims of these crimes. So the area that Austability operates in, or would like to operate in, is reducing the opportunity or the drivers for these things to take place. So to date, our differentiator or our key success tool has been our ability to actually engage with different organizations or national security agencies from the geographical areas in which we operate in to develop their ground up capacity, what they have in place. So we don't try and take an Australian strategy, for example, to the Horn of Africa and say, look, this is how you must counter transnational crime. We try and take expertise and develop a strategy for Horn of Africa that is owned by them, operated by them, and in a sense, adapted by them as a culture, rather than something that someone else brings to them that they know nothing about or they don't even believe in.
David, it sounds very much similar to sort of some of the changes happening in sort of the aid delivery world with the move towards social entrepreneurship. You know, go in, work out what people need, develop a product for them that they can own, and really, you know, they pay for the service of you helping them, but in the end, they own the product. They're able to run the product on their own, and when they need more help to develop it further, they can come back and ask. Is that sort of a fairly good way to sum up the essence?
That is a perfect way to sum it up, David, and that is, in our opinion, when we talk about sustainable strategies to counter terrorism and related transnational crime, is that there has to be a consensus amongst the end users and the beneficiaries of those strategies. Let's look at the lessons that hopefully we should have learned out of Afghanistan, for example, as an area, and we didn't, is that we tried to take in for example, the community, or even Iraq, the community-based policing concept straight out of the Western world and implemented there, where here you have cultures that are thousands of years old, and they do have their own community-based policing system in place. So what we should have done is understand what works for them and find the foundations and build on the foundations that it is second nature to them and they just believe in it. So then you can truly transfer knowledge and capability to them, and then let them be the owners of their destination, if you like, and then come back for support as it goes on. So yes, that's absolutely the way I would describe it.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of sort of Jim Gant's famous paper, One Tribe at a Time, where he made the point in Afghanistan, look, there is local legitimacy in Afghanistan, and it exists at tribal level. And if you tap into local legitimacy one tribe at a time, you will get buy-in one tribe at a time. And when you need a compromise between a tribe and the next tribe, it is going to have to come from the pre-existing level of local legitimacy. And, it was incredible how much buy-in there was to Jim Gant until too many tours had cost him too much. And, Special Operations Commands essentially washed their hands of him, despite the fact he seemed to be the only person who had worked it out, written it up in a way that was comprehensible, and that people wanted to apply.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And as I said, I would like to think that Austability and us are actually pioneers in this thing, but that'll be far-fetched. I think we're one of the small organisations, and if I'm not talking out of school, fairly similar to SIA, and what you and John are trying to achieve is that we actually get what will work, but understanding what works and the strategies being different doesn't necessarily lead to you having hundreds of contracts, because it is challenging the status quo. So we must, organisations like ours must stay the course and challenge the status quo and educate the world, basically, that the old measures do not necessarily are the answers for the new and emerging threats.
Yeah, Einstein got it right. You can't expect a different outcome when you keep doing the same thing. Again, John and I get sick of...
It's a definition of insanity, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. John and I have this debate so frequently that it's just like two parrots talking to each other.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're trying not to be insane in a fairly agile and evolving security environment. So just not keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, because it just will not happen.
I've worked in the Middle East for a while, and the one thing that is an obvious difference is, as you yourself have just mentioned, is the approach to things, and even approach in terms of how various agencies of government deal with themselves. Some would say it's Byzantine. It's certainly stovepiped. As an outside organization trying to make sense in a security understanding of this environment, how is it that Austability interfaces with this very outmoded, I suppose from a Western perspective, a very outmoded way of doing things? Here in the West, it's all about network-centric, all that kind of good stuff. But in the Middle East, Horn of Africa area, one could hazard a guess that that's not necessarily the case. So that must pose special and unique challenges to the foreign entity trying to sort of make sense of the security of the local domain.
It does, John, and that took a number of years to actually get our heads around that and understand it. However, once you actually understand, going back to a conversation we were just having a little bit earlier, is that once you actually understand there are security apparatuses and mechanisms in these parts of the world, and there have been there for hundreds of years, if not thousands. So how you interface and understand that is to first and foremost understand how have these people or different geographical regions have been keeping themselves safe well before we arrive. Now, the idea is that they are looking to actually apply mechanisms of continuous improvement to their current policies and procedures. And what is often being misread is that when they're trying to develop what they already have or improve it to be better, we feel that they have nothing. So we bring a solution out of the box. This is what we do differently. So when we go to Ethiopia, we don't approach them by the understanding that, look, you guys have nothing. Just because what they have doesn't sit within the map of what we have in Australia, of what we call national security. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
So what we first do and what we learn to do is, and this being an Australian company and us being Australians really helped us, because it really goes back to our values and culture as being Australians, being from a multinational country that has basically been developed on immigration, on welcoming different people, etc. So taking those lessons and walking into a geographical area such as Ethiopia or the United Arab Emirates with the due respect of what people have and their way of life usually lowers their barriers, and they're willing to share with you. They will tell you what they have. They will tell you what they feel the issues are. And us, rather than imposing or enforcing what we feel national security should look like in Ethiopia, we exchange ideas, we transfer knowledge, we learn from them as much as they learn from us, and together we develop a strategy that is developed by them, owned by them, and bought into by them from the outset. I feel this has been a success story for us in the way we interface with different agencies over the last 10 years or so. Again, it's a process that takes time to build trust. It's a process that there's been a lot of opposition to it. There is no quick in and out, but it's a process, John, that you do see the difference as you're moving along, and that's what we inspire to do as Austability. We want to see that difference, and that's what makes us happy.
Yep.
It's one of those really interesting things that, you know, the Americans got to the state of having to create, you know, the human terrain system and create human terrain teams, because at the end of the day they couldn't get past their sense of cultural superiority. You know, America's amazing, it's democratic, everyone wants to be like them. In some ways, the great Australian advantage is we're not quite sure who we are, but that means we're more open to working it out as we're going along, but also letting other people be themselves.
And as Australians, we're not, in this part of the world, I can say for certain, that we're not seen as a threat or seen as a nation or a company that wants to come in and basically change their way of life to fit into our way of democracy, if you like some of our allies do. So we're actually seen as people that are quite humble. We get along with everybody. We know our place in the world, yet we have some high level of expertise that we can export. Those expertise that, if you look at it, have actually contributed to the Australian national security for many, many years. Some people might say, look, Australia is lucky, or it's on the other side of the world. That's why it doesn't face so many terrorism problems or so many transnational serious organised crime problems. I would argue that in our game, luck has nothing to do with it. I would argue that as our national security agencies can develop quite a lot, but the point is that there is no arrogance about our national security agencies to a level that exists in other places. So we're humble, and that is my firm opinion. And based on that, we have been able to, touch wood, protect our country the way we have to date. And I can see that we'll be doing that quite well. So that model actually sits well with majority of the organisations in this part of the world. If I may make a quick example, right now as we speak, we have 12 members of Kazakhstan Ministry of Justice in Dubai undergoing a skills enhancement program in forensic linguistics with us. Now, I can tell you that they had the pick of almost every nation in the world to undergo this with, but they chose to seek out an Australian organisation and seek out an Australian methodology all the way out of Kazakhstan in order to develop their forensic linguistic skills. I mean, that speaks volumes as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, it's very interesting you sort of mentioned that example, because I've had an opportunity to spend some time with some Mongolians where they have that distant friend policy, where the point is to look for the people out in the world who are totally accepting of, well, you're far away, but you just let people be. You help skill us up, but you don't demand that we comply politically or culturally. And I think it comes from the great example of all the peacekeeping Australia's done since the 1980s, that immaterial of what's going on at the level of the political elite or the senior people within organisations, the people who actually deploy are normally under-resourced, under-prepared, and end up doing well because of their humbleness and their adaptability. So ironically, it's, kind of being the middling power that bumbles along gave us the beginnings of our great advantage.
I don't think our friends in DFAT would see it from that perspective, David. But yes, you're right.
I don't have a problem if they don't.
We're a mature middle power. I just thought I'd have to say that.
No, look, I think that is spot on. So if I could, get a message out to perhaps your listeners, John, or I think more small and innovative Australian private sector companies in the national security. The resistance is not as bad as we think it would be at home. And two, the Australian methodology is actually welcomed once you find your niche, because people like dealing with us because, we're easygoing, and like the old saying goes, you'll be right, mate. Nothing is too difficult. Yeah. So we'll be able to get this done correctly.
So David, what challenges do you foresee in operating in the Middle East and Africa, where a lot of things can go wrong to undermine the security of government or private infrastructure and assets?
The biggest one that we see is obviously in the case of the bribery at the highest levels. That exists quite a lot. The other challenge that we see, and we have spoken to a number of organisations, particularly international organisations, it appears from the outside that the only solution that they can think of, particularly in the Horn of Africa or the Africa region in general, is that to develop national security is to actually throw money at different governments without any sort of real accountability. I know they're trying really hard. However, because that money is coming from politicians in most cases, I guess their answer is, hey, look, come election time, I can tell my voters that we've spent $500 million on XYZ place and we're really good people. So those two challenges have been around for a while, and they'll be around for a lot longer if we don't actually change the way we do things. And that actually poses big threats to the different sectors you just mentioned, John. That'll be the two key ones I can put my finger on at the moment.
That underlying thing is people need to believe you're there to help them increase their level of agency, and their level of agency, not how you perceive their level of agency should be.
The other side of it is that they, in most cases, some of the organisations we've dealt with, it's not so much that they're after money or they're after you telling them how they should do things, is acceptance of who they are and what they have. So more so they're looking for collaboration rather than enforcement and being told how things should be done.
And now we'll take our usual musical interlude. You're listening to Strategikon, the podcast of SIA. And that was Save Me, the 2001 hit by Remy Zemo. And for those nerds out there like myself, it was also the theme song to the hit US TV series Smallville. And now we'll return to our interview with David Khandan of Austability.
Yeah, it's very much the sort of stakeholder relationship model where it has to be a plus-sum game. That rather than you get something which is pay, everyone gets something. You get more knowledge about a new place and they get an enhanced skill set without compromising who they are. So everyone walks away having grown and learnt new things about a different group of people and a different set of skills.
That's exactly right. I couldn't agree with that more.
Digital terrorism is an interesting phenomenon. Arguably, it's very much a problem for the developed world where much of its critical infrastructure has migrated into cyberspace, arguably making everything that we rely on vulnerable to those who can launch an effective cyber attack. What are you seeing in terms of the cyber capabilities of terrorists today?
One of the actual divisions that we're trying to really promote these days is what we call DETECT. It's basically digital terrorism encounters, countermeasures, tutelage. That's what it stands for. It's a mouthful, but it's called DETECT. Now, what is different between that? If I could take you back and to one of my earlier remarks, one of the things that we must understand, John, and when it's said out loud, it might actually seem quite simplistic, yet the individuals or organizations that are developing countermeasures to defeat or keep the emerging terrorism or digital terrorism threats in check, individuals and organizations that have absolutely no understanding of the millennials, the way they operate and the emerging threats. So we're trying to develop strategies when we don't really understand the drivers, the motivations and the operating landscapes of the threats we're trying to counter. So what is the solution to that? The solution to that is, again, embracing and trying to educate the young generation. What we must do is to basically embrace the young generation and provide them with the due respect of the skill sets they've developed since they've been very young. Now, you could have 19, 18, 20-year-olds that have been in and around the digital world since they've been 4 or 5 years old. So to get them engaged in national security agencies or development of strategies, we mustn't be so rigid about our selection criteria that unless you have demonstrated capability in a similar organization for the past 10 years, you don't even get past first base. So what that needs is an actual reform of current engagement capabilities of national security agencies and defense agencies to allow in fresh faces, fresh and innovative ideas. That's number one. Where I see the threat going within the next 2 to 5 years is literally the battleground will change and become a digital battleground. The conventional way of fighting or terrorist acts, etc., in my opinion, will phase out a lot quicker than we think. And everything will take place on a digital platform. And I am afraid to say that I think we're far from being prepared to deal with what is coming, because we just seem to think that we're in control. So I guess the answer to your question is that the next 3 to 5 years will be quite interesting to watch as the battleground is shifting a lot more than what it is now.
The level of connectivity among many of the countries that you'll be operating in will be less than ideal in terms of if you're trying to use a Western benchmark. So I agree to a point that things are going to be developing quite fast over the next 5 to 10 years. But as I have witnessed in the UAE, they have all the mod cons there, but it's not necessarily a free-for-all in terms of the internet environment. There are firewalls and various other things that can continue to stovepipe information in ways in which a local agency can administer, but not necessarily share information across fellow agencies if a requirement is needed, which then comes back to Austability. And, if you're going to be trying to act as a facilitator to try to create the workaround, the information workaround, if you will, how do you think you can manage that, especially since all the countries from the Gulf to the Horn of Africa will have varying degrees of connectivity, varying degrees of expertise in cyber, and the rest of it will be kind of like the wild frontier.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's one of the challenges that the industry faces, the trusted information sharing networks. How to address that, that's not an issue that can be addressed overnight. That can be addressed by educating the industry over a period of time, as long as there is an acceptance there that there must be a better level of connectivity internationally, because the things that we're forgetting is that the emerging battleground, be it digital, has no borders, has no laws. You can't say, look, this is UAE jurisdiction or this is Australian jurisdiction. So there is a borderless international battleground coming, yet we're trying to counter it and defeat it by our borders and different guidelines, legislations and policies. That is a massive issue, that is a problem that must be discussed. But more than that, it is now time to develop a strategy and start actioning it, rather than having conversations around it, which is what the international community has been doing for the past 10 years. What we seem to be doing is always talking about things and not actioning it. So how strategies should be developed, if you were to ask me, we have a United Nations that has a number of different countries, 194 I think, that have seats there. I cannot see why there couldn't be a division, or let's say a new United Nations that gets born, that has their agenda is regulating the international digital platform, if you like, and the emerging threats that are coming. Because the current conversations around global institutions such as UN does not emphasize the threats we're facing in terms of digital threats. That is what's emerging. So an action needs to be put in place, and needs to be put in place now, because I'm afraid we're way behind the 8 ball.
David, to sort of jump back to your comment about the importance of connecting with young people and their skills and experiences, it kind of makes me think of the example of Iraq 2004 to 2009, with Stan McChrystal essentially saying to Joint Special Operations Command, we are losing, we need to change, and moving from a hierarchy towards a network, more of a hybrid organisation structure, but probably more importantly, this thing of youth, of recognising that the expert is the person at the coalface, the person who's dealing with it every day, which is normally the youngest person in the organisation, actually is the most likely person to have a better answer. So in the case of Special Forces, they got to this understanding that change was necessary because they were starting to consistently lose. Is there a sense of that same realisation happening in the region you're working in?
There is, but not as advanced as this way of thinking, and that's what must change. Because by involving the young generation, we'll actually be able to achieve two things. One, bringing in new innovative skill sets to the industry that understands the operating environment. But what you do also is, by recognising their skill sets, you reduce the risk of youth becoming vulnerable groups that are then exposed to online grooming, online radicalisation, and a number of the threats that take place digitally. Why? Because we don't recognise their skill sets, so they keep those skill sets hidden, and then they end up in places that they shouldn't, and then they get taken advantage of, and all of a sudden an innocent teenager could very well become a very capable radicalised hacker that will act against the state. So by not bringing him into the workforce, we're actually losing the battlefield on two fronts. One, we don't have skills, and two, we are by default creating opportunity for our youth to become prey or fall prey into the hands of adversaries that are looking to develop different strategies.
Yeah, you end up losing talent and losing a citizen all at the same time.
Exactly, and that's, if you look back over the last 3 to 5 years, you will clearly see that amongst the Five Eyes or the allies, etc., is that particularly when it comes to the digital age and with the youth, all they're after, really, in my opinion, is recognition. And when they don't get that recognition, they get pushed into a corner of the society that makes them vulnerable because they don't have that identity. And one of the core drivers in majority of the cases of terrorism and radicalisation is not having that identity. So then you've got groups coming in and giving them the sense of belonging that they really should be receiving from their nation and communities. And that attracts them to those groups. And then they put their skill sets to work for those groups rather than putting them to work for their community and country. So it's quite simple, but we're not seeing it and we're not addressing it, and we must do so, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's stuff that Durkheim really had worked out by the late 19th century, but because in the Western model people were behaving, we didn't learn the lesson. And now people are not necessarily behaving. We have to accept that, if you want people to behave as citizens, behave well and contribute, you have to give them an opportunity and a reason to do all three things.
Exactly right, David. And I thank you for making these connections. And it takes me back to, again, a point I made earlier, that I would like to think that Austability is really a pioneer in most things, but we can't take credit for it because we have had, over the past 50 to 100 years, very smart scholars and people amongst us, but we choose not to listen to them. So what Austability does is try and understand what those people were trying to say, and every single one of them says that don't have a reactive approach to national security and terrorism. Be prepared, but understand your operating environment, and don't continue doing the same thing over and over again. I think the answer, when you think about it, John and David, it's sometimes, it appears so simple and yet so far from reach. And what we're struggling with, I can only put it down to the fact that our current defence and national security agencies, particularly in the Middle East and Africa region, do not want to change because the way of life that they have at the decision-making level, they're too comfortable with. So bringing in new strategies that will probably root out corruption is not in their best interest. So, and in most cases, there has to be a coalition where, if you want to make an omelette, you've got to break the eggs first.
Yeah, it's that terrible thing. It has to get worse before it gets better.
Exactly. And we're yet to see the worst part. That's the part that worries me as a human being, not just an officer of Austability. That's the part that concerns me for my family, but it should concern a lot more people, that I don't believe we've seen the worst of it yet.
I'm just curious with regard to one aspect of our discussion, and that is, the importance of cyber. In the West in particular, we tend to put a lot of focus on cyberspace. We put a lot of focus on electronic and signals intelligence, and that's all very good and fine. But obviously in places that do not have the infrastructure necessary to measure up against what we have in the West, owing to either poverty or lack of infrastructure, human intelligence becomes mission critical to prevent terrorist attacks. Does Austability have the capacity to deal with containing terrorism through the employment of human intelligence assets?
Human capital is the most important part, John. And if you look at the way we approach in developing capability, we'll look at three key areas, and those areas are current capabilities, current equipment, and procedures. The current capabilities only revolves around the human capital and the indigenous human capital to a geographical area. So we absolutely have, and we place emphasis on finding the right human capital and getting them to a point that they can efficiently deploy equipment and procedures to provide a blanket of security, if you like. So technology is great, equipment are great, but all of that means nothing that if the human capital, the indigenous human capital of the geographical area, their skills are not enhanced, or there is not enough knowledge transferred to them so they can operate efficiently within their operating environment. As you said, in most of the areas that we'll look at, let's take Ethiopia, for example, that level of connectivity is not there. It doesn't mean that the digital terrorism or the digital threats will not pass through their countries as a transit country, or end up there as a destination country, or be a source country for some things that end up as a digital crime, such as child exploitation material that go online. So there's many elements that you've got to look at, but expanding and enhancing the human capital capabilities is key. And yes, we absolutely have those capabilities, John.
One of the things that I noticed on your website is the emphasis on women and child protection, which of course is a very hot button issue in the West. However, in countries that don't share our cultural understanding of women and child protection, there are those who simply refuse to acknowledge Western cultural legitimacy on these issues. So how does Austability cut through this very difficult conundrum?
When we speak to organisations and we're promoting the Child and Women and Child Protection Division, we approach it from the fact that we get them to understand that the security challenges we're facing today, particularly in relation to terrorism and transnational and serious organised crime, is because we neglected the most important elements of our society, being our women and children, 40, 50, 60 years ago. We educate them on understanding that these stakeholders, if you like, in the terrorism domain do not just fall out of the sky. So if you truly want to address the idea of radicalisation or terrorism, one, you must deal with the issue at hand now. However, you must put strategies in place which stops the flow and the recruitment of further human capital for those organisations that are bringing terror onto our way of life. That is why we have the Women and Child Protection Division, and we promote that division because those are the core elements. You see, the education of a child starts at home, well before they attend school. So if a child is to be groomed and become radicalised by the time he or she is 15, that started 15 years ago. If I take you back to New South Wales and not long ago, the shooting in front of the New South Wales Police HQ, a 15-year-old kid with a gun in his hand shooting somebody point blank. You don't really think he became radicalised from 13 to 15. No, that happened because the family environment wasn't right. Why? Because as countries, we forget about those important elements. So when we explain these to even in much underdeveloped countries, in places such as Horn of Africa, they're all of a sudden able to connect the dots as to why that is important, why women's rights are important, why child protection is important. Is important because we're trying to tackle the drivers of terrorism, transnational and serious organised crime, rather than dealing with the issue sometimes well after it's too late.
It's just making me think of the debate in the 1990s after the genocide in Rwanda, when suddenly the human security movement really picked up steam, because the reality had kicked in. Unless people have fundamental security, in their basic lives, something is going to go wrong. They will be radicalised. They will be used to achieve violent ends if they don't have other choices. So, we had that debate in the mid-90s and then everyone went back to sleep. But because of 9/11, we woke up a bit and then went back to sleep because we didn't seem to be winning. But it always keeps coming back to human security. The fundamentals of giving women and children more choices is the fastest way to change a society.
And protecting the vulnerable elements of our societies. If I make another example for you, we were engaged in almost a 3-year contract in a correctional facility somewhere in the Middle East. I won't name them. However, the biggest thing that we were able to achieve there, it put in place an organisational discipline that supported the female correctional officers. What they right out neglected to see is that these females were mothers and wives, and what was happening to them at work, and at times in terms of post-traumatic stress, was directly reflected into their family lives, directly reflected onto their children, etc., etc. So over 3 years, we were able to actually see a big difference in the quality of family life of women that went home after work when they had just, for example, witnessed an inmate commit suicide, and that inmate was the mother of a very young child, for example. They were able to deal with these issues. So not only we forget about protecting our vulnerable elements of the society, we actually forget to provide strategies for our men and women of uniform that spend their lives protecting us. and we think what they suffer in the course of protecting us doesn't reflect their family lives and just has a ripple effect. I mean, the issue is far bigger than anybody's even willing to think about it. And as you said, David, we start talking about the conversation, it sounds good for a while, and then we all go back to sleep. And I can't understand why we do that for the life of me.
I'm hoping at the moment that we've got the Invictus Games in Sydney at the moment, and I'm hoping the fact that that's very much a two-sided thing. It's very good for the defence personnel with injuries and wounds and sickness to have a chance to use sport as part of their rehabilitation, but it's a way to get the community to re-engage with these people who served and suffered for us. And I'm hoping that will be a real wake-up call for Australians to kind of see this thing that, at heart, people who serve deserve a lot more from us as a society once they've finished serving. That everyone who makes an effort for all of us is owed more than we normally give them.
I could not agree with you more. And as an Australian, I'll share a quick story with you. In probably 2015, I think it was, I was fortunate enough to have a quick trip with some of my friends. 2 or 3 of us, and we went to Gallipoli. And one of the things that will stay with me in life, I know people read about it, I know people have seen videos and movies and all that sort of stuff, but if you actually stood there and saw the distance between the trenches in which the Turks were in and the trenches in which the Australians were in, it would blow your mind as to how the Australian soldiers continued getting out of those trenches every time the whistle blew, when they know that all their mates in front of them never will be going home again. Now, if people were willing to do that for us, so for us to have the way of life we have today, can you really put a figure or a strategy on what it is that we owe them as a nation? Because I can't. So not only we're not doing enough for them, we haven't even established what it is that we should be doing for them, David.
Yeah.
And that is a quite sad fact of life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, gentlemen, that brings this episode to a close. David, thank you very much for joining us live from Dubai, and hopefully we'll be able to have a chance to speak with you again soon.
Thank you very much, John, for arranging this. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm humbled that yourself and David gave us your time for us to tell you a little bit about Austability. And I'd like to say, please keep up the great work that yourself and SIA are doing. We're happy to be part of the SIA family now. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very
David.
much. Bye, David. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategikon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn and YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help us improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.